So I have 12:01, and in the interest of time and for the benefit of everyone who has already signed on, we can go ahead and get started with a little bit of background information. I want to recognize Jen Bowman, who is the chair of the Ohio Basin Alliance Knowledge and Informed Decisions Work Group. Really has done a lot of work with her committee putting on these discussion series, and we try to do these in the spring and then fall and winter. So obviously we're in the winter now, and we are really pleased to bring to you today a very strong discussion series, and it's going to be focused on some of the partnership work that Orsanco, US EPA, Neptune, and just a number of organizations do together to help better understand some of the challenges that we're facing with the Ohio River. Ohio River is an amazing body of water. We are extremely fortunate to have such a great resource, at least in Orsanco's case, in our backyard, but it does have some challenges. So as part of the day's series, we wanted to talk a little bit about some work that Orsanco and our partners have been doing over the last several years. We've had some very significant algal blooms on the Ohio River in 2015 and 2019 that we'll talk about, and we'll be discussing those as well as some other work on our ambient PFAS project. Just want to call attention to some housekeeping items for today's session. Just to keep everything flowing well, if you can mute your microphone, disable your camera unless you're using them. At the end, we will have time for questions. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Please put in the chat all your questions and comments, and we'll be sure to pull those together at the end of the program after all of our speakers have concluded. We are planning to record this. We are recording this, and we will be making these slides and the recording available certainly on Orsanco's website, but also probably on Orba's website through a link to our YouTube channel. And also, we are planning to issue a PDH certificate. If anybody would like that, I know as a Kentucky professional engineer, I am happy to receive every hour of credit I can, and today's discussion certainly will offer good subject matter for that. So again, just email Nick Callahan at ncallahan@orsanco.org, and we will make sure that we email you a certificate so you can get an hour of credit for today's discussion. So back to just a little bit of overview of the program that we're going to be talking about. Certainly, algal blooms have been a challenge to Orsanco and really anybody that utilizes the Ohio River. I think a few years ago, we wondered if we would ever have anything like this. Well, the last few years have shown that indeed we do have that challenge. And then Orsanco recently completed a very significant ambient PFAS survey of the Ohio River, where we worked to characterize the amounts of different PFAS compounds in the river. So we'll be talking about it as well. We know US EPA has published their strategic roadmap, and in particular, we'll be utilizing this study as information for proposed aquatic life or really human health criteria that we're expecting US EPA to publish in draft format at the end of 2014. They've already published aquatic life draft criteria. And so this study that you're going to hear about will offer some good insight and background as to what is the current ambient condition for about 28 PFAS compounds in the Ohio River. So again, I know folks are still joining us, but I do want to get started. We have 4 speakers today for our discussion series. I also want to mention that we will be having our next one on February 8th, also at 12 p.m., and we'll be getting out information to sign up for that. We'll have information about the Ohio River Basin Alliance and work to develop a restoration initiative for the basin. I'm going to go ahead and start out and introduce our first speaker. We have with us Mr. Jason Heath, one of my Orsenco team members. Jason joined Orsenco in 1989 as an environmental engineer, and he is currently our Director of Technical Programs at Orsenco, wears a lot of hats, and he has been involved in watershed management and water-related regulatory programs through his career, and has designed and carried out many water quality studies in the Ohio Basin. And working through the team members at Orsenco, US EPA, and USGS, I'm very proud of the study that Jason is going to highlight here for us for the next 15 minutes. Jason, I will turn it over to you, sir.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, very, very well.
Okay, and you can see should be able to see my slides up there.
Yes, sir. It is in a slide format, not in a slideshow, but we see them clearly.
Okay, that should have changed now. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Heath with Orsenco, and I'm here to talk to you today about an ambient study of PFAS that we did in the Ohio River. And just as an example, watershed project. And I guess the 5 main points I'd like to make are about stakeholder involvement, development of study objectives, how we went about site selection, our sample collection methodology, and understanding some of the PFAS characteristics in a large flowing water body, in this case, the Ohio River. Moving along on the stakeholder involvement issue, we had a very deliberate process to design this study. We spent well over a year and had many virtual meetings, and this shows our stakeholders, Orsenco's technical committee, as well as others that include the 8 state environmental agencies, EPA, USGS. I left off the US EPA on this list. They were a significant partner in this study. Oh, there it is. Coast Guard, our industry advisory committees on drinking water and wastewater, as well as Watershed Organizations Advisory Committee. So a lot of people had their hand in developing this study plan and approving it. So we were fairly proud of it by the time we were done with the design. The study objectives, we were very clear in that it was to be an ambient survey, ambient PFAS conditions in the Ohio River, as opposed to trying to find hotspots or specific sources, which we were clear to say was not the study objective. The objective was to establish baseline conditions in the Ohio River under 2 separate flow seasonal conditions for 28 PFAS at the 20 sites. 20 sites was kind of picked as the amount of field and analytical work that we could tolerate at the time. So we wanted this survey to be repeatable within which we will plan to do again in 5 years. Part of the design included making sure that we were outside of any NPDES regulatory mixing zones in order for it to be ambient. Moving along, the site selection process, we wanted a probabilistic design rather than us just selecting the sites where we would sample. And we also wanted it to be spatially balanced such that there was good distribution of our sites. The method that we used, which I'll talk about in a minute, introduced a level of randomness while maintaining good spatial coverage. And by this method, it removed a question of folks asking, well, why did you sample here as opposed to there, and that sort of thing. So this shows the 20 Ohio River locations that were selected. What we did is divide the river up into 20 equal segments of 49.05 miles. And in the very upper river segment in Pittsburgh, we randomly selected a mile point to the 10th, which came out to be Ohio River Mile 11.7, shown right there. That was randomly selected, and then we evenly distributed the remaining 19 stations, each 49 miles apart. So the sample collection methodology, we used a U.S. Geological Survey large river method. It's called the Equal Discharge Increment Sampling Method, or EDI. It's great for trying to get an average condition in the water column across the entire water column, which is more so important in larger rivers. And so the way it's done is you can see there's this acoustic Doppler current profiler, and in this bottom graphic, what it does is measure velocities across. You're looking at a cross section of the river. It measures velocities across the river, and then based on that information, puts it into a black box computer program, and tells us where to sample so that we can get an average composite sample based on those velocities. At the same time, we also did some discrete sampling at a number of the locations to see if there was any unusual distribution of PFAS in the water column. So this shows a graphic of a cross section of the river. The EDI method told us where to sample at 5 vertical locations across the river. We lower a fish at a specific rate, and it fills constantly as we lower it at these 5 vertical locations across the width of the river, and then we composite those 5 samples to get our EDI cross-sectional composite. At a number of the locations, we also did discrete sampling. That is represented by these 9 points where we took a peristaltic pump and silicone tubing and lowered it to our desired depth. And at the 3 points across the stream, looking at is there any unusual distribution of PFAS in the Ohio River. We didn't see any of that based on our results. So just to give some very high level observations of what we saw for PFASs in the Ohio River. We did 2 rounds of sampling. The first round was under higher flow conditions than the second round, which was done later in the fall. So during the higher flow first round, we had more and slightly higher concentration PFAS detections than we did during the second round, lower flow condition. We did not see any systematic distribution of PFAS in the water column. Of the 28 PFAS that we analyzed, 12 of them had at least 1 or more detections. PFOS was detected most frequently, but at low levels during both rounds. It was detected at every site. It was the only of the 28 PFASs that did that. The higher concentration PFASs that had the most values above the laboratory level of quantification were for PFOA, GenX, and PFBA, which is a replacement for PFOS. Highest value observed was for GenX, which is a replacement substance for PFOA, and that was slightly higher than 30 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion. We had a significant quality assurance program where we collected an equipment blank at every single one of our sampling locations during both rounds. The results of that were excellent, with the exception of one occurrence. All of our quality assurance samples were below laboratory detection levels. So that was great. This being our first time sampling for PFAS, we didn't know whether our QA results would come out like that, but I would attribute it to the high professionalism of our sampling crews. And with that, just a couple of take-homes. The value of this data is the first comprehensive study of PFAS in the Ohio River, provides a level of information to state environmental managers as well as drinking water utilities that use the Ohio River as a source, and it sets a baseline so that we can sample again in the future to see if anything has changed. And I'll just leave you with this. Perceptions are very important. This was a comic done in the Cincinnati Enquirer that shows how great the Mississippi River and that the Ohio River is basically a toilet bowl, and it was based on a report done on toxic release inventory because the Ohio River has the highest poundage of toxics discharged to it. The conclusion was that the Ohio River is the worst river in the country, and I would argue that that is not even close to reality. We have pretty good water quality in the Ohio River. So with that, that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Jason. And we have a lot of information on Orsenco's website at orsenco.org. And all the data is on there, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that may come up. Please put your questions in chat for Jason, and we'll go ahead and save those till the end. Thanks, Jason. And I would like to introduce our next speakers, and they're going to be working really it's a similar topic, so they're going to be working together. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three now, and just for continuity, we are happy to have Chris Nietzsche here from US EPA, who is a research ecologist with US EPA's Office of Research Development in Cincinnati. He has worked on numerous water quality issues related to nutrient pollution for 20 years. He directs ecotoxicological research in the experimental stream facility and oversees a large watershed partnership. He's been a great partner with Orsenco through the years, really helped us with the project he's going to speak about. We're also privileged to have Leslie Gaines Germain here with the Neptune & Company. Leslie is a professional who focuses on environmental statistics and data science. She works on multidisciplinary teams to integrate physical and concept-based models into statistically usable modeling frameworks for prediction, uncertainty, analysis, and system understanding. And we'll have Greg Youngstrom, who I jokingly always refer to as our HABs expert, everything HABs and algal information. That's what Greg runs with Orsenco, one of our senior environmental scientists. He has worked in both government and industry for for 50. For 30 years, and with Orsenko, he does coordinate our HAB response and directs the nutrients program. And he will be speaking to us about our program. And he also serves on the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force. So please, I'll turn it over to Chris at this point. Again, put your questions in chat, if you will, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the session. Thank you. Chris.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Can you hear me okay?
Great. And the presentation is up as well.
Okay. And so I guess I'll just say next slide and y'all will advance it for me. Is that how you want to work it?
We certainly can do that.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Thanks a lot for the great introduction. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure to work on this project. So I'm going to, in the flavor of this discussion series, talking about data and types of data and communicating data, we're going to try to emphasize in this effort the data aspects that went into this effort, because I have presented on this project in a design or a discussion series earlier, it's like 2 summers ago. But since then, we have published a paper providing all the details of the Harmful Algal Bloom app that was developed. And that came out in early 2022. And that reference is on this title slide here, as well as the URL for the HAB application that we're going to be talking about today. So the project was born out of a need of Orsenko to be better able to characterize and monitor river conditions with respects to harmful algal blooms. And it was instigated and funded by our EPA Regions 3, 4, and 5 offices. And as you all probably know, this need became apparent after the 2015 bloom, which was unprecedented for a big river. It was a 938 mile long, or sorry, a 650 mile long bloom by the time it had finally ended, and it lasted for nearly 2 months. There was another bloom in 2019, but we got this project going before then. And it was largely to try to address, while no toxins were detected in finished water during the 2015 bloom, it caught a lot of folks off guard, and this effort was really designed to develop a framework for communicating and monitoring the risk of harmful algal bloom potentials on the Ohio River. So the project, like I said, began in 2018, and we had gotten pretty far, and then in 2019 we had another bloom. So now at certain sites we have two blooms to work with. And that was a constraint on our ability to try to develop a modeling tool that could predict those blooms, which was our ultimate objective, develop some kind of risk modeling probabilistic tool. So as part of that, we first needed to assess the causes. We did exploratory data analysis. We had to figure out the data availability and how we were going to go about trying to develop this risk model. And I want to note on the next several slides, there's going to be a whole lot of data on them and information, and you can kind of think of it as conceptual, just to give you a flavor for the information that went into it. But what we first noticed in looking at the historical flow data, which is here plotted in annual plots on the right, is that the 2015 and then following in 2019, those series across the season showed these late June and early July flow events that were then followed by this period of extended low flow. And you can see this at the Markland Lock and Dam site at 2015 and 2019. And then the red lines that are characterizing the time series show when those blooms occurred after that flow dynamic occurred. And we we thought about that flow dynamic, and we put that within the context of what we knew about harmful algal blooms in reservoirs in the Ohio River Basin. And this was a study that was published in 2021, and that's this conceptual model on the left describes what we were able to piece together from an extensive data set on water quality and harmful algal and phytoplankton in 20 reservoirs. And we described through that data analysis the important drivers external to the reservoir, and then important feedback mechanisms that are related to nutrient chemistry and reservoir conditions within them. And because the Ohio River, when it goes into a low flow state, is really a series of 26 reservoirs, can kind of be thought of that way, we felt like we could use this conceptual model to try to drive the way we were trying to put our risk characterization framework together. So next slide, please. This figure is a side view cutaway of a Tantor Gate at a lock and dam on the Ohio. And we hypothesize, and again, this is just a hypothesis. We haven't figured out a way to test this hypothesis. But what we think is going on with these blooms and how they are linked to those unique flow conditions is that as the dam gates close to maximally be able to maintain an upper pool depth under low flow conditions, the increasing residence time of the pool produces conditions that favor the proliferation of planktonic cyanobacteria. That proliferation is fueled by the particle-bound nutrients that are washed in from the watershed during those late June and early July rain events that have become effectively detained in the pools. And under that detainment period, the pool hydraulics change to affect biogeochemical processes that increase the availability of those particle-bound nutrients. So this mechanism is what is depicted in the right-hand part of that Tantor Gate diagram. And what is key to this hypothesis, and what we use to drive how we developed our modeling framework, is that the key is the relative extent of the rain event and the timing of those loading events, and then the subsequent duration of the low flow period. Next slide, please. So what I just said is kind of depicted in the right-hand part of this figure as a process flow diagram. It just suggests that large loads of particle-bound nutrients that come with high flow events are detained behind the river's dams as the flows decrease. And as pool residence time increases, as the dam gates close, the trapped nutrient loads are made more available by shifting hydrodynamics, which in turn affects the nutrient biogeochemistry. And we had data to support this hypothesis, and we felt like it was a good way to start framing our model development work. And what it means is that we essentially turned towards developing surrogates for these mechanisms using the flow data. That became our way to go about the model development. And the large influx of midsummer nutrient load is the idea that provides this fuel, but it only works if the timing is correct, and the loads can't be completely flushed from the system before the phytoplankton biomass can concentrate. Next slide. So now what I'm going to do is, so what perplexes people often is that we are really only basing our model development on flow data. And the next few slides, I'm just going to quickly go through why that we think that makes sense. And so this first one addresses the question about satellite data sources. We get this question asked to us quite often about what about using satellite data. And the bottom line is that the state of satellite remote sensing is just not up to par, at least for publicly available satellites, to be able to assess algal conditions in the river. And that's what's shown on the right in these graphs. The best satellite to use is Sentinel-3 right at the moment. Sentinel-2 satellite might be able to get it, but methods for identifying harmful algae are still being developed for that, even for lakes. So rivers are a long way off. Next slide, please. So the next thing we thought about was, or one could think about, is using water quality parameters and continuous ones, because one of our objectives was to provide a real-time risk characterization for the entire river. And so, let alone that water quality, continuous water quality data isn't available for the entire river, only at a few sites, even when it is available for a given site, the data here on this slide kind of show why it might be problematic in terms of using it to drive a risk model. And so the left-hand data is dissolved oxygen dynamics. These dissolved oxygen can be invaluable for characterizing algal activity, but in using it within the context of trying to predict algal activity, this is just multi-years of data of dissolved oxygen plotted here on the left top graph, and it just shows that the 2015 and the 2019 data times that the blooms occurred does not stand out enough that we could hone in on for a model as a predictor for a model. And likewise is the case for temperature. We always get asked about temperature. This is the same type of data on the right-hand side with temperature, year-over-year temperature signals for the year. And you can see in that September timeframe where you would have the bloom, the 2015 and the 2019 data are not a standout. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what we would ideally like to do is be able to link our risk modeling directly to what the algae, the cyanobacteria, are doing in the river. But there's a lot of high temporal and spatial variability that occur with cyanobacteria populations or phytoplankton populations in general. This slide shows, is meant to depict some of that variability, at least with respect to time. And this is a site, this is data that was generated by Heather Mayfield when she was with FOR organization. She was sampling outside of the Orsanco offices there in the Markland Pool. And she was doing approximately weekly to bi-weekly sampling. And you can see that the red area behind these plots is the bloom period for 2019. The left is just relative abundance of all the dominant algal types, and then the right is the relative abundance of different genera of algae. And just scanning through that pre-bloom period and the post-bloom period, the light blue on the left is the cyanobacteria. You can see that at this location, they might have signaled the initiation of the bloom, but trying to use this data in a risk modeling framework, given the temporal variability, is quite daunting. And you would also need to have this data at other locations, which we do not. So that's the temporal component of directly linking to phytoplankton. If you turn to the next slide, the spatial component is somewhat depicted here, and that is high spatial heterogeneity within the Ohio River. So the data on the left is from a fixed station continuous monitor. In this case, the continuous monitor is outfitted, it's managed by Marshall University, and it was outfitted with algal pigment sensors, total chlorophyll and phycocyanin, and those are the two data points on the two data plots on the bottom of this multi-panel plot on the left. With the bloom period in 2019 shown in red there, this is 2.5 years of data. Green up, this is in the green up pool, and it bloomed in 2019. And you can just scan to the left of those vertical red bars and note that there's nothing about those time series on the bottom two plots that would suggest algal activity was really high during the bloom period at this site. And that's because phytoplankton communities are so spatially heterogeneous, and that's what's shown depicted on the data on the right-hand side of this plot, which is a longitudinal survey in the Markland Pool, where we just had these sondes with the same two sensors hanging out of the boat and we gently at idle speed kind of went around each bank of the river for 10 miles up into downtown Cincinnati and back. You can just see by looking at the variability in the algal indicators as you kind of drift through the river, so to speak, you can see how variable it is. So this spatial variability makes it really difficult to think about using directly related variables to phytoplankton for risk modeling. Next slide, please. So we went back to settling on trying to use those surrogates of the flow data to drive our risk characterization. And that is what is depicted here. After some time, we landed on a predictor that was a combination of lag terms that represented those high flow events and then followed by the low flow events that we hypothesized were critical to the HAB development. The data on this slide is just the plotting of a ratio of lagged exceedance terms that are the primary predictors in our model, which Leslie's going to talk about next. So the degree of similarity of these predictors is what's driving our risk probability. Next slide. So we took all that information and started heading into model development, and we developed our risk characterization framework. Again, it's based on flow. It was developed, we developed a web application for serving the model results, and then we developed approaches for obtaining and reporting water quality data associated with harmful algal bloom activity. And then we review, part of that framework is to review this modeling approach and update it annually. And with that, we're going to hear a lot of more specifics about the data behind our application and the models, and then how that application is being used, which it has now been in use for 2 years. Appreciate it. Leslie, you take over, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening, and thanks for the introduction, Richard. My name's Leslie. I'm the statistician on this project. I maintain the data behind the risk characterization tool that Chris described, and I also built the statistical model and wrote the code behind our website. Next slide. So I'd like to start by talking a little about the data that are behind our web application and behind our model. So Chris mentioned at the beginning of his presentation and throughout that the flow pattern that we noticed right off the bat after plotting the discharge data from 2015 was this extended period of high flows in late June and early July, followed by this extended period of low flows. So what I'm showing on this slide here is the time series of daily average discharges in 2015 for every site along the Ohio that was included in the training of our model. So in that top bar there above the plots, I've colored the USGS sites teal and the US Army Corps sites the light red color. So the plot really here you can see that we see a similar pattern in flows in 2015 at all the sites, even at the locations upriver of Pike Island that did not experience a bloom. The plot on the right here is one that Chris showed, but I've added arrows that point specifically to the Army Corps locations, and all other locations without an arrow to them are USGS sites. So you can see there's more USGS sites, and we probably could have trained our model on only the data from the USGS, but we chose to aggregate data from both sources, both for quality assurance and to fill in the gaps geographically. So specifically, there are a lot of Army Corps sites in that stretch between Hannibal and Huntington. Lastly on this slide, I want to emphasize that these visuals are one of the primary features of our web application. So I'll show you some screenshots on the next slide. The statistical model gives us a number which quantifies our the bloom risk on any given day during bloom season, but it's not necessarily a substitute for looking at these plots and making a direct visual comparison of the current year's flow time series compared to 2015 when the widespread bloom occurred. So a primary objective and feature of our study and our tool is to allow a user to log on and then really quickly be able to make a quick side-by-side visual comparison of the current year's conditions compared to what occurred in 2015. Next slide. So on this slide, I'd like to show a recent upgrade that we made to the app. So we recently made the front panel here on the right side of the map a little simpler. And specifically, we simplified the way that we were providing the HABS risk probability. So previously, we had a table here with more information and a confidence interval, which that information can still be accessed. But now we're simply showing the HABS risk as a probability, which is that 0.211% that you see here. And then below it is a line graph that shows the 7-day trend in the bloom probability. So this slide here shows the current view of the homepage when you open the app. And since it's currently winter season now, the HAB risk isn't shown for today. It's actually shown for the day in the previous bloom season, which in this case is 2022, when the exceedance ratio was highest. So you can see that the bloom risk was not very high this year. It only got up to about 0.22% at Cincinnati at the end of September. So another feature here is on the front panel is you can select a year in the comparison year toggle in the upper right there, and you can look back to previous years and it'll show the week of highest bloom risk that occurred during that year's bloom season. Next slide. So on this slide, I've selected 2019 for comparison, as I just described. So you can see that at Markland in 2019, we predicted a 23.9% bloom occurrence probability on August 15th. And this was very validating for model because, as we've mentioned, a bloom did occur at Markland in 2019. So below that bloom probability of 23.9%, the line graph shows the probability in the week leading up to August 15th. And you can see that it was fairly high over that whole week, between 16 and 24% about. Also, what I'm showing on this slide is the exceedance ratio plot instead of the discharge plot that I showed on the previous slide. So you can see that's selected using the choose a plot toggle and on the top of the panel there. So the top plot shows the values of the exceedance ratio at Markland in 2019. So if you were using this app in real time, it would just show the time series of the exceedance ratio up to the current day. And then the bottom plot shows the values of the exceedance ratio in 2015. And again, we get this sort of side-by-side comparison of how large was that peak in 2019 and how large was it compared to 2015. So you can see that it did peak, but it wasn't quite as extreme as 2015, which makes sense given that the bloom wasn't as widespread in 2019. Couple other things about the app. The default location that's going to load is Pike Island, but you can click any of the sites to find out more information about them. Also, the sites on the map and then also in the line graph are color-coded as either green, yellow, or red based on bloom risk. So a bloom probability less than 1% will show up as green. A probability between 1 and 10% will show up as yellow, and greater than 10% will show up as red. So selecting the values, these breakpoints that we would associate with each color was a little bit of a learning process. In general, they ended up being a little lower than we might have expected. And this is simply because that 2015 bloom event was so extreme, and we haven't seen anything quite that extreme since then. So this is something we're hoping to continue to calibrate and improve as we gather more data. I also want to point out the nuance of the scale of the data that the model's trained on versus the data that are given it in real time for prediction. So models trained on annual data where we summarize a maximum ratio for every year. But in real time, a ratio is given to the model each day. So the model actually acts as if that current day's ratio were the maximum ratio for the year. So this is kind of part of the reason why it's important to watch that bloom probability and that ratio each day throughout the bloom season. Next slide. So next, I'd like to talk about some of the details of the statistical model and the predictors that are behind it. So there are 3 explanatory variables in our model. One is the exceedance ratio that Chris described and that I'm showing on this slide here. And just to reiterate, it's a ratio of 2 lagged average exceedance terms that captures that pattern of high flows followed by an extended period of low flows that we saw in 2015. A second predictor in our model is the number of days that this ratio has been increasing in the 15 days prior to its max. So the reason we included this is because we wanted to capture when that ratio is spiking or increasing sharply. And the third predictor in our model is the residence time of an individual pool. So what we found was that high exceedance ratios are indicative of blooms, but not if residence time for a pool is very low. So we observed in 2015, those sites above Pike Island didn't bloom even though the exceedance ratio is high. And this was because of that hypothesis that water's moving too fast in those pools to allow the algae to grow. So the way we translated this statistically is to allow for the effect of that maximum ratio on the bloom risk to depend on the pool. We included an interaction term in our model between the exceedance ratio and residence time. Next slide, please. So the second part of the tool is an evaluation of bloom persistence, and this is actually an entirely separate model, and we developed it because our bloom risk occurrence model that I presented so far isn't actually useful once it's known that a bloom has started. So once a bloom started, we use this persistence model that will predict whether the bloom will continue. And so what I'm showing on this slide are the flow conditions during the bloom at Markland and McAlpin, both in 2015 and 2019. And what you can see here is that about halfway through the bloom period, there's this spike in flow, and that's what the red arrows on this slide are pointing to. And then we noticed shortly after that spike in flow, the bloom stopped. So we wanted to build a quantitative predictor from this information. So to do this, we evaluated the 0 to 19 day average exceedance, which is actually one of the terms in our exceedance ratio. And we saw that at most sites, this average exceedance steadily decreases throughout the bloom, and that the bloom typically stops before that term reaches its minimum. So we used this info to build like a 0 or 1 binary indicator into our model. And that indicator, along with the maximum ratio value and the number of days after bloom started, is used to predict persistence. And next slide. Thanks. So on this slide, I'm showing how that bloom persistence model result is used in real time during bloom season on our web app. So first of all, you wouldn't actually look at this part of the app unless a bloom was unless the bloom had already started. So for this reason, we don't actually put the results of this model on the front page. But if a bloom does start, you can select under the choose a plot toggle dropdown, you can select model results persistence, and the results of our persistence model will come up. So it also brings up this two-dimensional plot, which shows both the value of the maximum ratio and then the number of days since that ratio occurred, as well as the probability of bloom persistence below it. So you can see on this slide that there was 0% chance of a bloom persisting on October 31st of 2022 at Cincinnati, which makes sense, but it actually, because there was no bloom, but it wouldn't even make sense to look at the persistence model in this case because there wasn't a bloom in 2022. It looks like I'm running a little close on time, so Greg, if you could skip ahead to the last slide. So I'll just wrap up here in summary. We've made some recent updates to the app that I've described in this presentation. We simplified the front panel. We upgraded the software. We removed some bugs. And for future work, we have a couple items currently in the works and ongoing. First off, we're working on a sub-application for data management that can be used for Orsenco or another agency to manage and validate their data before actually publishing it to the main app. And then second, we've been working with NOAA to retrieve their flow forecasts in real time. And if we can get this going, it could give us up to a month of early bloom warning if those flow forecasts are reliable. So overall, this is active work, and big thanks to Orsenco and EPA for continuing to support it. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. We will turn over to Greg with the difficult task of wrapping this up in the next 6 minutes. Greg, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. I'll just talk fast and we'll get through this. So I'm Greg Youngstrom. I'm one of the primary users of this tool. So I'm going to run you through data that's available, how I use it, and how I communicate it. A primary thing is to focus resources. So the Ohio River is big, 981 miles long, 35 drinking water utilities, multiple states, multiple federal agencies, and we have a HAB plan that says what we will do. And since Orsenco is located in Cincinnati, just upstream of Cincinnati at mile 462, so we're kind of right in the middle of the river. So I'll just kind of run through this, how we do this. Kind of step 1, observe a trend. 2, interpret the data. 3, confirm through sampling. And 4, our communication strategy if we actually have a harmful algae bloom. Also, I frequently get reports of harmful algae blooms or potential blooms from citizens, lock and dam operators, people working on the river, that sort of thing. And in a case like that, how I use the app is a little different in parts, so I'll point those out as we go through it. So Leslie showed you this as the landing page for the app. I keep a regular tab on this through the algae season, which really begins in June and ends at the end of October, about there. So first thing I do when I open this up is I say, hey, are all the lights green? Green is good. So it's if it's all green, that's a quick glance at what is our probability, and then I can click through on each individual station and look at the trend, which is on the bottom right, on the right hand side, that graphic, if you look at the bottom, it gives you that 7-day graph. What are we looking at for a trend in probability? And if it's not going up, that's a good thing. And as Leslie pointed out, you can also look at the flow on that right-hand side to get an idea of how things are progressing on the river. And in this case, really I'm not looking at the specific percentage as the main indicator, but really kind of what's the trend? What are things starting to look like? Or is it heating up, or how it's going? I can dig through, there's menus across the top. This is model results, so I can look at the model results in comparison and get an idea of the spatial extent of an issue. If we're seeing increased probability of blooms, in this case, if you look at around September 1st, there's an increased probability from about Huntington to about Cannelton. And that was short-lived for 2022. It wasn't really a bloom, but that's the sort of way that this data can be used in some of the deeper dive into the data availability on the app. So we can start answering questions about if we get a report, if somebody calls in a report, there's a picture on the right that was a potential bloom reported on the Licking River as it comes into the Ohio, right across from Cincinnati. And we can look at the HAB app and the data and start answering questions about, if we have an increase in probability or a report, is there an increase in data or increase in algae that can be seen in the data? Is there DO temp or pH? Are those indicating algal activity, or are they similar to what was seen in the past? So we can start diving into data. The water quality data sondes are less dense than the model results, but we can look at the nearest ones and start looking at things like this is the dissolved oxygen plot for Ironton. And in the bottom plot, we can see this diurnal pattern of oxygen, which is indicative of algal population increasing. So as we start getting that up and down all from day to day, that lets you know that there's an increase in algal activity. And we can also look at the pH. pH on the Ohio River is usually in the sort of high 7s. 7.5 to 7.8 is probably pretty typical. When things start getting over 8, then you start thinking that there's some algal activity that's probably pushing that up. Some of the sensors also have specific pigment sensors. So this one is chlorophyll A, and we can look at the chlorophyll specifically and start seeing if there is an algal response going on here. And we can also, the next one shows phycocyanin, which is a pigment that is associated specifically with cyanobacteria, which would be the ones causing the harmful algal bloom. And if we're seeing a spike in algae or in chlorophyll, but not a spike in phycocyanin, then we may be thinking that, yes, we have a bloom, but maybe it's not a harmful algal bloom. And we can also use this graphing data to compare sites and see, so we can look at extent and get an idea of what's going on across the river. And so kind of what are we, where are we here? We've used this data to help kind of focus our efforts. And if we're seeing an increase in probability, then I can look at our water quality sondes, but I can also call drinking water utilities that are in the area, and they collect data more, it's going to be more dense spatially, but not as much data. So they may have pH, turbidity, that sort of thing. And I can start asking questions about what it is that they're seeing in their water systems. And then we will also, to confirm a harmful algae bloom, we'll put people on the water or collecting samples from the shoreline. We want to identify what the algae is and whether or not it's a toxin producing sort of algae. And we have a number of people that we work with to collect this sort of data. I'm going to move along kind of a little more quickly here. And then Orsenco's responsibilities. So once we have identified a algal bloom, then we'll inform our Water User Advisory Committee, our state and federal HAB managers, and the spill list to get a wide distribution of who knows about this, so people know about this bloom. And then we do a number of things. Orsenco focuses on determining the extent and whether or not there are toxins. We do not issue recreation use advisories or water use advisories. That's up to the state's health departments typically, but we do coordinate with the public information officers of the states to get that information out and make sure that everyone is informed that needs to be informed, and have advisories posted at access points to the river. We also act as a repository for any data collected during an algal bloom on the Ohio River. And there's some information on our website, general HAB information. There's a link there. There's also a link to our communication plan, monitoring, response, and communication plan, and a link to the HAB app. And I think with that, we're going to go back to Chris with any acknowledgements that he wants to give.
Well, real quick, they're all listed on here. There were other key individuals in this study besides just Greg and Leslie and I, and those individuals are listed on this this slide here. We definitely want to acknowledge that without their support, we wouldn't have been able to pull all this off and continue to pull it off. So appreciate the attention, and Richard, will give it back to you.
Well, thanks everyone. Amazing job. Really pulling what's probably 2 to 2.5 hours of presentations into an hour and 4 minutes. So thanks everyone. Just a reminder that we do have our next session on February 8th at 12 p.m. We'll be sending out a notice on that. And please, if you have any suggestions for a future topic, we'd love to hear those. That is Jen Bowman's information. I will call this meeting over right now. We will stay on for questions if anyone has that, but just want to give a couple moments for folks to sign off. We will be sending out links to the data as well as the YouTube channel to all the folks that registered. So you'll be getting that here in the next week or so. But again, thanks everyone for your participation. And then we'll just hang around here with the presenters just for a couple more minutes to see if there are any questions. We covered a lot of information very quickly. And I will just say that from Orsenco's standpoint, HABs and PFAS, these have been a couple of significant efforts over the last 5 to 7 years, and I think this was a good synopsis of both of those projects. Also included Jason and Greg's email address in there if anybody has any questions. So we are getting some questions. Can core dam modifications perhaps be used to control more widespread HABs? I know we have spoken with Eric Emery with the Corps, and the Corps is embarked upon a project right now to look at their operations of their dams. It's been more geared towards working with Habitat and DO modifications, but that's certainly something I can pass on to that group. There was some discussion that perhaps the release of some of the water from reservoirs that maybe had really high incidence of halves might have an impact, but that's a good question. We can certainly pass that on to the experts. And did see a note here from Mindy saying she looks forward to the recording, and yes, we will share that. Again, we have subject experts on here, and we can put you in touch with those folks. I think we consider 20 locks and dams on the Ohio River, and that's where we monitor, Carrie. Other questions?
Hey, Richard, if I can,
Yes,
I was
Chris,
just gonna add to the bit about the dams and can they be used to control the HABs. That has been a running question of ours, and as Richard pointed out, the Corps is funding a study to look at that. But I just want to point out to keep in mind that there is a minimum pool depth that has to be maintained by the river to support navigation. And so when these HABs are occurring, we are in low flow conditions. Those Tantor gates on those dams are locked down so that very little flow is going through to maintain that depth. And so that really constrains us, that minimum depth condition, which by the way is it would take an act of Congress to change that depth. So yeah, that limits our ability to think about the on-river dams to provide some support in trying to flush the blooms out. But yeah, the reservoirs and maybe some combination of the two, but that takes some really skilled hydraulic engineers like the Corps has to work out.
And Mindy did confirm that, Chris, that there certainly is work to look at the role of dams in this. Any other questions? And I apologize. This is complex material to cover so quickly, but we do like having a 1 hour session. It gets through a lot of information quickly, so it's really a balancing act. Any other questions? And I would just thank all of the partners again. Are very proud of our skilled scientists here at Orsenko and the work that we do, that they actually do on all of our behalf that use the Ohio River. Appreciate Chris and Leslie's work. That's been just a great effort. We're continuing to try to build the number of sensors we have in the river and to really figure out how we're going to be able to share that information with the public. And Leslie, what do you use for the RT in the model? That's a question from Kate Zidar. Is it calculated?
Yeah, this might be a question for Chris, but we have a mean residence time for each of the locations. Chris, can you speak more to how we got that?
Yeah, so we worked with Richard Boyer, I think is his name, and Eric Emery to find that. His name was on the last acknowledgement slide, so I just want to make sure I got it right. But just see. Thought I had him on there. Anyway, Robert Moyer. Sorry about butchering that name. We worked with him and Eric Emery to define a pool volume for every pool on the river, and then we just take that volume and the discharge to estimate what the residence time is on at any given point. We have flow data for that pool. But in the models, the residence time is an average residence time that is just meant as kind of a characterizer for each of the pools. So the pools upriver are going to have for any given or for a similar flow flow frequency, the pools upriver are going to have a shorter residence time than the pools downriver, just by nature of the bathymetry of the channels up there. So yeah, the model uses a mean residence time, but then we estimate the residence time at every given time point of flow based on average pool volume.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the question, Kate. And as I stressed early on, boy, what great partners we have with the Corps and US EPA, USGS, awesome contractors, consultants. It really helps, and we use at Orsenco, responding to this and really providing great service to our partners is a huge component of what we try to do. And so this model, you hear, well, you can never really predict the have, but it really does help inform us. And so we work to notify our states, to develop the extent of the bloom, to measure the bloom. It's pretty hectic during a bloom. Greg always jokes that he's going to schedule his vacation every September, but he does not do that. He's very much involved in this. And so this has really been helpful for us so that we can help respond more quickly, more efficiently. We have 21 employees, about a dozen scientists available to work on this. So it's all hands on deck. So the more we can learn, the better prepared we can be. It's great. And so this rare grant, the work with Chris and Leslie has just been amazing. So I will say that. Any other questions? And we'll send everyone off on a late lunch. And I just want to thank everyone for your participation, and thanks to Jen and Orba for really being the emphasis for this session and allowing Orsenco to partner with you on this. All right, with that, thanks everyone. Have a great day.